Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Two Wizards and a Mic, where two old D&D players sit around, talk about D&D, and share our thoughts, our wisdom, our pearls of wisdom, and all of that kind of fun stuff, and hopefully learn something new along the way, because that's who we are. Let me take these off because that shine is just outstanding. How's it going? My name is Shane, and this to my left,
I'm
or
Andrew.
right the other way. And this podcast is, of course, brought to you by Cawood Publishing, worldofmere.com. Go there and buy everything, because if you don't, I will cry. And tell us what we're talking about this week.
We're talking about the last class for us to cover for Dungeons and Dragons, the Warlock. And there's two reasons it's last. One, it comes last in the classes alphabetically. And two, I could take it or leave it.
After reading the notes and actually going through the book a couple days ago, I couldn't really tell a difference between these and sorcerers in a lot of ways,
Right.
and they seem very similar. I mean, they of course have their own take on things, but for me, I was just kind of going. This sounds very, very, very. This all sounds very the same, but tell us about it. I want to know more because I've made a realization during my research.
All right. Well, they're quite interesting, as they are not a part of. They weren't a part of the game originally, and we're talking about a spellcaster who makes a pact with an otherworldly being. They are often thought of as having darker elements to them, because the most famous example of a warlock would be Faust, who made a deal with the devil, a very famous figure in literature, and there's many versions of Faust now. There's lots of modern versions, like that movie with Robert Redford, Woody Harrelson, and Demi Moore. I can't think of the name of it right now, but that's another. There's many Faustian examples. I'll look it up, but there's many examples of this kind of relationship, making a deal with the devil, usually, as I said, as a darker figure, and it comes back to haunt the person who made the deal. Another example would be Saruman in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, who serves Sauron, of course. And another one would be Raistlin from Dragonlance. There's also the Summer and Winter Nights in the Dresden Files books, which we mentioned quite a few times. There's Elric from the Moorcock books, which were some of the inspirations for Gary Gygax for when he started D&D. And many examples of warlock type creatures in comic books as well. As I said, an interesting class. Because that I personally don't use evil PCs in my campaigns. I did when I was maybe a kid, when I was like 10 or 12, trying out the game. We played all different kinds of characters. But to me, evil PCs break the game. To me, the game is built on, usually 3 to 5 heroes working together in an adventuring party, fighting a creature, and that's how the game is, built mechanically. So that splitting the party doesn't make a lot of sense unless it's brief. And evil PCs, to me, they seem game breaking because there's no reason for an evil character to continue to work together with this party or to have the same goals as heroes. So I understand there's lots of different tables, but for me personally, many warlocks would be evil and they would fit more into being an NPC. Although I do like some of the different versions of the warlock that have surfaced, because it doesn't have to be with an evil creature and an evil pact. So they have decent hit points, 1d8 hit points. Um, they can actually survive in melee combat, unlike wizards and sorcerers, um, because they have access to light armor, some decent weapons, decent hit points. Their skills are pretty limited: two from Arcana, Deception, History, Intimidation, Investigation, Nature, and Religion. Their main spellcasting ability is Charisma, like the sorcerer and
Yeah.
the bard and the paladin. Um, they get a gift from their patron at third level. So there's patron Pact of the Chain, Pact of the Blade, and Pact of the Tome. So basically, you can either choose to have an amped up familiar with extra powers, a special weapon with extra powers, or a book that gives you 3 extra cantrips from any spell list. So those are some bonuses you get. Um, you don't get as many spells playing a warlock as compared to the other spellcasters. And that's one of the reasons that sometimes they're not as attractive. People are not as interested in playing them.
Right.
You have very limited spell slots, and you get those refurbished by having any kind of rest. But that means that ideally you'd want a game where you have a lot of long rests. You do get extra spells when you get your subclass. You get a few extra spells, but again, you don't have more spell slots. You do have invocations, which there's a huge variety of them, these extra magical powers. And those are some of the cool things that can boost your spells and enable you to see in the dark, hide yourself, basically camouflage yourself. So we have three subclasses in the player's handbook. We have the Archfey, the Fiend, and the Great Old One. So this way you can figure out who their patrons are. So the Archfey, that's the one that interests me the most, liking Fey quite a lot. So your patron is a powerful Fey creature, and you get the ability to charm or frighten creatures as well. You can use Misty Step to escape when you take damage, which is pretty useful. You get to be immune to being charmed, and you can actually reverse the effect on somebody who tries to charm you. And you also have the power later at high levels to send a creature into a shadowy realm, just basically similar to banishment. So
Send them into the glass dimension.
Yeah.
The glass
Well, yeah, there's actually, I believe it's an invocation. Is it an invocation or is it? Oh no, it is the next one we're going to talk about. So
Okay.
Fiend class, you can even do more. So the Fiend, obviously, it's with a fiend, a demon, a devil, or some fiendish kind of creature. You get temporary hit points when you reduce a hostile creature to 0. So very vampiric sort of relationship. You get a special luck ability to add 1d10 to checks and saves. So that's pretty intense. You get to choose a damage resistance at higher levels. And then the other one we're thinking about was the ability to hurl through hell, which basically you can banish a creature into hell. They are so traumatized by this trip that when they come back, they take 10d10 psychic damage.
That is brutal.
Which, Shane, I'm
I
sure you
love
would
that.
love to do this.
Well, I mean, I was going to say earlier that, like, during my research, that I realized that the characters that I chose for um, when I was a tiefling, for a couple of those characters where I was a tiefling, the thing that attracted me was that there was this, pact that was, somewhat made along the way. So that's how the character was born. But I
Mhm.
never thought of it as evil. The only way I could see an evil character, an absolute, like a complete evil character
Yeah.
in a party, is if they were placed there, like, the villain of the story is like, hey, you got to get in there and you got to help him out because you got to steer him a certain way, to not, because otherwise you sit around just waiting for somebody's back to be turned. You're like, well, I'm evil. Stab, 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 stab.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's kind of, I mean, that's okay, I guess, but it really gets boring very quickly. But having someone like, a spy, in the midst of the party is kind of interesting, and you could play with that in a couple different ways. But I have to say, tossing somebody just straight into hell, I love that idea. I really want to do that. Please, please, I will make a character to make this happen.
Then we have the last subclass, which is the Great Old One. So your patron is this mysterious, otherworldly creature, um, almost like an alien creature, more like an aberration in D&D. So that gives you some telepathic abilities. You can magically ward off attacks and, again, turn them around on your enemy. Your thoughts can't be read. And later you can actually infect a humanoid's mind and turn them into a thrall for you. Basically, like a zombie that would work for you.
Does sound cool as well, to a certain degree.
So I think part of it too with me that I'm so not used to them being part of the game, where a lot of the original parts of D&D are still there. Warlock is such a foreign idea to me that I haven't really got into playing the patron, which I think is the best part. And I definitely would now, looking at them more in more detail, I would now always have the patron as a very big part of the game if somebody chose a warlock. And I would have the patron do some interesting things because the warlock could accidentally stumble on some power. Maybe they read a book, and just in the process of reading the book, now they have a pact with this, maybe an archfey, and now they are in their service and they have no choice. Now they're in the pact. That's it.
I read the book. I'm sorry, but you're doing this thing.
Yeah.
Go get me a coffee. I don't want to get you a coffee. Just do it anyway.
Go get me a mead. Yeah, or you have a patron that has a romantic relationship with the warlock. I like that idea too, where it gets very complicated. I think that is one of the really interesting parts. I think most of it is there's lots of great ideas, but practically it doesn't really work that well at this point. I wonder why they limited them so much in their spell casting. I think they definitely, because most of the time, I think almost 50% of the time, the best action for most warlocks is to take Eldritch Blast, to use your Eldritch Blast cantrip. Like almost all the time.
Yeah.
Especially at low levels.
That's the only reason I did Eldritch Knight. It's like, I can't hit that thing, so blast, 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 which kind of gets boring after a while, to be honest.
Yeah, well, there's some confusion too, because the Eldritch Knight is one of the fighter subclasses.
Right.
But yes, I would say as far as cons, the overly dark elements always seem to come up because you're in the service of something that has maybe other motives. And it's almost you're almost a slave in a way to that creature. I know people can't even say that word anymore, but I'm saying it. So yeah, the spells are extremely limited. If you don't have a game where a dungeon master gives you lots of short rests, like yeah, then you're not going to be as useful because you're when you get a long rest, sure, like the other casters are getting all their spells back.
Yeah.
And that's going to happen more often in many games. I don't know about most games, but many games, because of the way adventures are run. I don't know a lot of DMs who give tons of short rests. I don't, for sure. Maybe we're going to get. I would say, excuse me, most of my games, I would say there's one long rest in a session of 3 or 4 hours, and sometimes 1 or 2 short rests. Usually only one. It depends. Like that would be most games. Games where you're traveling across the
Yeah.
country and maybe you are on horseback or you're traveling by ship and the more and longer periods of time are passing, then you're going to have long rests in there, but probably not many short rests either. So
No, I think primarily in the games that I've played, it's basically a short rest if we've really done like a significant battle, but we don't want to stop. We want to keep going.
right.
Um, Generally, I would say probably one short rest per session. Sometimes that's actually a long rest, and we don't do a short rest. But
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
ultimately, I think for our games, it's primarily if we've been hammered by whatever we've encountered.
Hmm.
Um, that's generally what we will do. Especially if we're in the middle of a battle, like if we end the session and we haven't finished that encounter, and then we continue the same encounter the next game. Um,
Right.
that's usually when we do like a short rest. Is like, oh well, let's do a short one,
Yeah.
get to the place we're supposed to be, and then we'll do a long one. Um, but yeah,
Yeah. Because if you think you're a warlock, you cast one or two spells, three spells, you could be out
yeah,
until a rest. And if you're playing, the other casters who need rest to get spells, full rests, they they still have lots of spells left. And they can go
yeah.
like for the rest, maybe the rest of the session or for a long time. And the warlock's just waiting, like, when am I going to be able to recharge? And the DM, you know, the game is, it's just not really, it's not, again, like I said, it's not really practical because the game's not built like that. It's not built to have lots of short rests. Um,
Yeah.
and if you can get away with a session without having a long rest, it moves better too. So yeah, like I limit it. Like again, like we said, maybe there's one short rest and one long rest in a game in a session. Often just one long rest, really, and
Right.
sometimes none. Sometimes none if there's a lot of action, which we have a lot of action. um, so I think there's lots of good ideas. I think some of it's kind of impractical. I think the patron story, with this being who has the pact with the warlock, it can be very cool. I think as far as the pros, but you have to have a very creative DM or player who's gonna help build this patron relationship. Otherwise, I think for the rest of the party that can get boring after a while. Um, because it's different than a cleric and a paladin because those are very much in line with the class, whereas the
Right.
warlock could be opposed. I mean, he could be opposed. He could be working against the warlock's patron. Could be working against the warlock. Could be working against the party. I mean, they could be allies of your enemies. So I think you have to be very creative to do it well. Um, the fact that they have light armor is a really big bonus. So they're, if you have magical leather armor or studded leather, you can actually have a very decent armor class, and you can use proper weapons, unlike the wizard and sorcerer.
Right.
I think they're very attractive to min maxers, which weren't really a big part of D&D when it started. But somehow in that time where I left the game from second edition to fourth, there are a lot of min maxers in the game now. And our show is not even really like that. We don't even really talk about it that much, but always trying to get your optimum build to have the most effective character. I think it's kind of a video game mentality, maybe. And they're very
I would
popular with that
agree.
kind of character because people will multi-class. They'll take a few levels of warlock and then something else.
Well,
So
and that's the thing is that when I think of like finding that, as you said, which I totally get, that whole the idea of the perfect character or
mhm,
the perfect balance
yeah.
of a character in a game, um, that's kind of what I think about when when I think about that in terms of D&D. I think about dual classes, where
Yeah.
you have
Yeah.
potentially a spellcaster and something else together, or a thief and a fighter, which is weird, but all these sorts of things that people have done, and that was one of the first things I encountered when I started playing, back in the day,
Hmm.
was one of the books that my parents got me, because I didn't have any money, um, was a book about multiclassing, and that was all the book was about. So I
Right.
was reading this, going, "Oh, this sounds like pretty standard fare," which
Mhm.
in hindsight it totally wasn't. But it did kind of give you this idea that there's all of these options out there where if you don't necessarily want to be just a whatever, you can have these classes come together and you can level them up differently. Um, but yeah, I think overall, in terms of the Warlock, um, I could see a decent balance between like a Warlock and something. I would say maybe a fighter.
Yeah, we
I don't
have
know.
one in one of the campaigns right now. We have a player playing and they think that they've done it
A
before.
fighter Warlock, really?
Yeah, I'm pretty
Have like,
sure, and I think this is the second time they've done that build.
but it
So
is. I mean, it can give you a lot of oomph to the character because especially.
for
I mean,
sure,
I think you would only do that if you really wanted to be more of a bruiser, sort of more of a character that can throw a lot of a fight into any encounter, but
yeah,
also heal. Well, Warlock's not really about healing though. It's sort of just looking at the book here, and I don't see it as like a healing class at all.
no, no. They
But I could
might,
see a
well,
healer and a fighter, I suppose, like a druid fighter or something like that. But that would be, I don't know. I always
yeah,
found multi-classing as being very difficult to really manage well.
yeah.
But anyway, yeah,
I think in the beginning of the game, I remember it often as there are many NPCs in many of the adventures and the original modules, especially Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, where there were many NPCs that were multi-classed, and it was an interesting balance. Not usually really high level, many times low level.
yeah,
So I found it interesting when I came back to the game, and there's quite a few people who like multi-classing. I don't think it's not super popular from my experience, but there are people out there, and that general idea of trying to make this character that mechanically and almost mathematically that they
yeah,
can do the most damage and they can have the highest armor class and it it's a yeah, I find it an interesting point of view because that's not how we looked at the game when it started.
no, totally not.
um, and I don't remember there being a lot of, and it was different now than now because you didn't know what other players and other DMs were doing because there was no internet. um, you'd have to go to conventions back then really to meet people or the local gaming store, and there weren't as many people playing. But my impression is there weren't that many people doing that. It just seems like I said, like a video game sort of mentality of trying to, make sure your character can keep surviving in the game, as opposed to being a role playing game.
Yeah, that to me, I mean, this is the thing with from attacking it from that perspective of it being a role playing game. It's one thing that I'm trying to get better at is to actually have the character with a story that really matches what they've become as a class.
Hmm.
Like that's the sort of challenge I think that a lot of people they focus on the mechanics, they focus on, oh, well, I'm going to be a wizard and I'm going to do these 10 things, which is
Hmm.
fine, but I think it's a lot more fun and actually is far more important than when you have these backstory characters where you actually spend time, which I am terrible at most of the time, but I'm trying to get better at it, where I can actually have the backstory actually tell the character, okay, you've had this encounter, you've had this life, you've had these experiences, this is where you went. And that to me, I think for actually a couple of my characters, when I've really tried to get into the deep into the weeds of the backstory, that I changed what they were gonna like. I was gonna be a fighter, and I decided to be a spellcaster, and vice versa. So these kinds of things I think are kind of ignored at the beginning because they really want you to understand the dice. They want you to understand all the checks you can make and all the things you should be aware of in actual the mechanics of gameplay.
Hmm.
And it's touched on, of course, and they talk about it quite a bit, but not enough to kind of go. But the most important part is it's a role playing game where you are playing a character. You're not playing a fighter. You're playing Biff, the great swordsman of the East Coast or something, you know? So you
Mhm,
have these
mhm.
elements that just get tossed on the floor, I think, by especially by newer players, which is understandable. The newer players are not going to know what they're going to be doing ultimately. They just know that they have these weird looking dice that at some point they have to roll on the table and go, okay, I rolled a 5. What does that do? That means you're dead. Oh, well, that sucks. Okay. But, these kinds of things, I think it would be really great that um because I know in October, spoiler, we're going to be talking about how to build a character and all these kinds of elements to the game. But I think we should probably talk about the actual role playing aspect, maybe individually as well, because I think that part is it's hand in hand with everything else, but it always plays second fiddle. I think, but that's just my experience. So
Yeah, again, I think a lot of that is influence from video games and sort of this idea that the math and the end goal is the most important thing instead of playing the game,
like
you know?
Skyrim, for example, is a perfect example of that, where the math is kind of important. I mean, to the game mechanics, sure, like D&D, but I think when you play Skyrim, you've told me about the different characters you've created within
Yeah.
Skyrim, and you
Yeah.
actually gave them traits. Like every time, what was the one where they stole cheese,
Oh
and
yeah, yeah,
they had a compulsion to steal cheese every time they saw it. It's like, I'm sorry, I got to take your cheese.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that kind of stuff
Yeah.
is cool.
Yeah, to me, it's more interesting if there's role playing, if there's a reason and there's a story. So I would play, yeah, I had one character, Brie Cheese, who, whenever she saw the cheese, and if it was in an inn or a store or someone's house, she would just grab it, and she's hoarding it all in her lair. And of course, that causes all sorts of problems. She's wanted in every hold. And then I had another one, No Insults Carl, who, if anybody insulted him, he would attack them. So that happens all the time in Skyrim. So again, he's wanted in every hole.
Well, it's there's like there's a Skyrim player who has a YouTube channel. Her name is Shirley Curry, and you've
Yeah,
probably run into her.
yeah,
And for those who don't know, Shirley is this lady who is, I think, in her 80s. She picked up Skyrim maybe 5 years ago. Um,
hmm,
she decided she wanted to have a YouTube channel. She had
yeah,
her grandkids and family help her out to record and post things online. But her play style is really the important component, where she creates a character and she ignores the story of Skyrim. She's like, I don't,
right,
yeah, if I run into it, sure. But it's
right,
like, hey, I'm this character. I'm going to go and I have to do this thing. And
yeah,
eventually I'll get a companion. That companion will have to help me
yeah,
do this thing. And I just love that. It's compelling to watch because you're sitting there just at one level when you first encounter her channel of like, you're supposed to be the Dragonborn. It's like,
mhm,
she doesn't care about the Dragonborn stuff. She is
yeah,
Joe Smith, and Joe Smith needs to go and build a house on the shore in the north, and that's what they want to do. Which I kind of,
yeah,
but it does point out like how D&D is really a role playing game where even games like Skyrim that have a very particular story and a very particular set of rules, that you can still go out there and invent your own. Just play in the world and you're fine. You could,
yeah,
you know, I think I did that with being a vampire because the first time I ever played, not
hmm,
Skyrim, the one before that,
Oblivion.
Oblivion.
Hmm.
Um, I wandered around. I was new to this game. I'd never really played it. I love Patrick Stewart being in it. I think that was the attraction for me. And then I was in. I saw this tower in the middle of the woods. I'm like, I'm gonna go in there. Next thing I know, I'm a vampire because I got attacked, and my character, I'm like level 3, and I'm a vampire all of a sudden. I'm like, how did I become? And I didn't even recognize. I just kind of left the tower at one point,
Yeah, yeah.
and I started dying in the sunlight. And I'm like, what's going on? So I just kept playing that way, and I had wandered into this huge storyline about how not to be a vampire. But it was kind of fun, and it was, I think, my first encounter in a game where D&D really sort of said, you don't necessarily just have to go and do the thing the game tells you to do. You could do some other stuff. Just
Yeah.
have fun. Have fun. It's a game. Anyway, it's just
Yeah.
Whew. It's just a game. But yeah.
Yeah.
That's how we roll.
So we've looked at all the classes to some depth. We didn't go into the extra subclasses, many of them that have come up in the extra books. But we concentrated on the core books. We've looked at the races as well, the core ones. And so now we have an opportunity, like you said, to dive into the game more. The next game we can look at specifically what to do at the beginning of a game when you roll up a character. Which used to be you rolled 3d6, and you took whatever you got and you rolled them in order for your abilities, and then you built your character really around that. So if you got 16 strength and 6 intelligence, you probably were going to be a fighter. And so we can talk about that. We can talk about gameplay and role playing, like you said. We can go into more detail in certain areas, and we can do some deep dives into our books too, into the monster series, and go really into detail about where we got these creatures and what are the ideas behind them and the reasons for them. The funny thing in that book, in the Underworld book, one of the last minute changes was getting rid of the first monster in the book. Because back then we were doing an A to Z monster book, and the first monster alphabetically was an angel creature, because I thought it'd be interesting to have an angel in the Underdark, in the underworld. And I realized you cannot have a book about the underworld where you start with an angel. That's your first monster. So we changed that.
That's awesome.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I gotta say, I'm looking forward to getting into the rolling of characters and all that kind of stuff, because that's it's the basis of the game, and once you sort of have it in your head, then you can basically just run free with it after that.
Yeah, and there's so many more ways to do it. Like I said, back then in the late 70s, it was very simple. You just rolled 3d6, took whatever you got. That's your ability score. Do them in order of the ability scores. And you didn't have that much choice for class and race. Some of that, I think, was a good thing. But you do have a lot of options now for the players.
Yeah. And I don't want to spoil it anymore. We'll talk about it next week, boys and girls. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for listening on the audio version of the podcast. And don't forget all of the stuff that we talk about. If there's any links and all of our social media stuff, it's all down below the video. And talk to us there, because we're always around. We'll respond, because that's how we roll. We want people to have fun doing this, and we want to have fun making the show. So if we talk to you and you talk to us, life gets better. But I guess life is better with a game, I gotta say. But well, thank you, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye.
Later.